APUSH Unit 7, Chapters 23 through 26 Review Presentation.
America's Railroad Boom. There are 5 transcontinental railroads built: the Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, the Southern Pacific, Great Northern, and the Central Pacific. In 1862, Congress selected the Union Pacific Railroad Company to build a transcontinental railroad starting in Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific Railroad Company was responsible for laying track on the California side of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad was completed in 1869, allowing for increased trade with Asia and opening up the West for expansion. Many railroad titans felt they were above the law, and they abused the public by bribing judges and legislators. They also manipulated the natural monopoly of the system. Pools were agreements to divide the business in a given area and share the profits. Small farmers often paid the highest railroad transportation rates, while big customers paid low rates. Stock watering was when some people sold stocks and bonds in excess of the railroad's actual value. The titans of industry in the American South. Steel was king during the industrialization era. By the late 1800s, the United States was producing a third of the world's steel supply. Andrew Carnegie was a large titan of industry. By 1900, he was producing a quarter of the nation's Bessemer steel. J.P. Morgan financed the reorganization of railroads, insurance companies, and banks. In 1900, Morgan bought out Carnegie for $400 million and created the United States Steel Corporation in 1901, America's first billion-dollar corporation. Many obstacles slowed down Southern industrialization. Even in 1900, the South still produced fewer goods than it had before the Civil War. The Pittsburgh Plus pricing system was an economic discrimination against the South in the steel industry. The South excelled in manufacturing cotton textiles. Cotton mills were eventually created in the South, but they paid workers extremely low wages. Challenges for the industrial worker in early American labor unions. There are many challenges for the industrial worker. Low-wage conditions caused some factory workers to go on strike. Corporations sometimes force their workers to sign ironclad oaths or yellow dog contracts. Some companies owned the company town and increased the prices of basic living expenses so that the company could make more money. Strikes became common, and the middle-class public started to get annoyed. To fight the challenges, there were a number of early American labor unions that were organized. The National Labor Union organized workers across different trades and challenged companies for better working conditions. Black workers formed their own colored National Labor Union. The Colored National Labor Union could not work with the National Labor Union because the latter supported the Republican Party and it was supported by racist white unionists. The Knights of Labor was led by Terence V. Powderly and started as a secret society. They sought to include all workers while campaigning for economic and social reform, including codes for safety and health. Some of the impediments to the labor movement was that the National Labor Union died out in 1877. In Haymarket Square, Chicago police tried to break up a protest against alleged police brutalities. Someone threw a dynamite bomb, killing several people. The Knights of Labor was blamed for the incident at Haymarket Square and as a result lost public support. Another problem with the Knights of Labor was that it included both skilled and unskilled workers. When unskilled workers went on strike, they were just replaced. The greatest weakness of organized labor was that it was accepted by a small minority of working people. Another example of impediments to the movement was the Homestead Strike of 1892. Henry Clay Frick, manager of Homestead Steel Plant, cut wages nearly 20% and used the lockout, private guards, and strikebreakers to defeat the workers. This set back the union movement in the steel industry. Nonetheless, labor movements ultimately made an impact into American politics. The Department of Labor and Commerce was made in 1903. This new cabinet position was created to address concerns of labor in business. The Bureau of Corporations was also formed and investigated and reported illegal activities of corporations.
In the 19th century, there was a major increase in the amount of immigrants that came overseas into the United States. Immigrants during the 19th century mostly came to the United States for its economic opportunities or to escape hardships at home. The first group, the old immigrants, came in the early 19th century and refer to the people that moved from mostly Western Europe, most likely from Germany or Ireland. These old immigrants played a key role in the development of the Americas, as along with them, they brought new ideas, religions, and cultures. Immigrants from Ireland played an important role in the construction of railroads around the country. In addition, German immigrants brought with them the knowledge of technology and brilliant education systems. In the later 19th century, we had new immigrants, and they were often from Eastern and Southern Europe. Many of these new immigrants were Catholic or Jewish, which greatly diversified culture and religion within the United States. They feared oppression back in their home countries, especially in countries like Ukraine and Russia. They wanted to seek refuge from any torture and unfair treatment they had back in their home governments. America created many new people that. Ooh, I was doing so good. During the Gilded Age, there was much more of an emphasis on education for all children. In 1870, only about half of the nation's children received any formal education. Although many states provided free public education for children between the ages of 5 and 21, many families kept their children out of schools in order to work. However, by 1900, elementary schools were mandatory by 31 states. Most of these schools taught arithmetic, reading, and writing. Throughout a 10-year period in the Gilded Age, around 5,500 high schools were built and 1,500 colleges. Schooling was also prevalent for African Americans and immigrants. African Americans began to attend schools, greatly attributed because of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. In addition, many immigrants were sent to school in order to become Americanized. This also included Native Americans. Another aspect of the Gilded Age was this idea of yellow journalism. It first began in New York and became prominent between the magazines New York World by Joseph Pulitzer and New York Journal by William Randolph Hearst. This was a term used to describe biased journalism that was often unethical, unprofessional, and skewed. It was mostly used in order to increase sales of newspapers and magazines. It was often used during the Spanish-American War, blaming the Spain for the problems in Cuba and showing the torture that the Spanish were doing to the Cuban people. It was very influential for the American public and increased public support for the Spanish-American War. Another aspect of the Gilded Age was the change in late 19th century literature. During this time, American writers began to discuss new cities, industries, and document contemporary life and society. The three major themes of literature during the late 19th century were the ideas of realism, naturalism, and regionalism. Realism dominated post-Civil War American literature, mostly discussing romanticism, the supernatural, and everyday life. One of the most famous realistic texts from this time was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, both by Mark Twain. Mark Twain was a very famous author who greatly changed the idea of American literature. The next, naturalism, was a much more in-depth look at social dislocations and scientific detachment to humans. One of the most prominent novels from this time was The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. Finally, regionalism discussed local ways of life before the industrialization period in America. One of the most famous novels from regionalism was The Awakening by Kate Chopin. Beyond literature, there were also many changes in music and art.
In the presidential election of 1868, Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant wins the presidency for the Republican Party. He wins for two primary reasons. One, because many newly freed black voters now vote for Republican. Two, that he waved a bloody shirt, meaning that he used Civil War memories to get votes. However, there were a lot of corruption and scandals during his presidency. One of them being the credit mobiler scandal. In this scandal, railroad insiders hired themselves at high prices by bribing Grant's vice president. Another scandal was the whiskey ring. In this scandal, Grant's his private secretary steals excise tax revenue from the treasury. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 guaranteed equal accommodations in public places and prohibited racial discrimination in jury selection, giving blacks more freedom. However, this was overturned in the civil rights cases of 1883, which stated that the 14th Amendment only forbid government violations of civil rights, not individual violations. This made it so individuals could discriminate against blacks. Because of this, Jim Crow laws spread throughout the South. During this period, there was also an increase in Asian immigration, especially from China. The Chinese mainly worked in the railroad and mining industry, and this led to a nativism towards the Chinese, especially in the West. Soon, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed. This prohibited further immigration of Chinese laborers, and it became the first immigration restriction placed on a certain race and nationality. In the politics of the Gilded Age, patronage was used by both parties, and this was also known as the spoils system. The Democrats were mainly located in the South, hence the name Solid South, but they were also located in northern industrial cities. On the other hand, Republicans were mainly located in the Midwest, the rural Northeast, and freedmen in the South. A large chunk of the Republican vote also came from the Grand Army of the Republic, which consisted of hundreds of thousands of Union veterans. However, the Republican Party was divided into two factions. One faction, the stalwarts, were led by Roscoe, and they believed in patronage. The other faction, the half-breeds, were led by Blaine, and they believed in civil service reform. To combat the patronage in the Gilded Age, Chester A. Arthur passed the Pendleton Act of 1883. This established the Civil Service Commission, which required an exam to get a federal job.
Indian Relations and the Dawes Act. Native American population declined due to disease, fighting, and the decline of the buffalo. The decline of the buffalo happened because of the overpopulation of Indians at first, and then they were overhunting them. Next is the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act stated that many tribes were no longer legal entities. It wiped out tribal ownership of land and had it put up for sale to rich landowners that wanted to come to the West. It also set up Indian families with 160 acres of land that they were to live off of. It also stated that they could receive citizenship if they lived on land for 25 years and adopted the civilized lifestyle of normal American citizens. Other things that came with the civilized lifestyle was adopting Christianity and working in the normal workforce. This brought great change to Native American lives. Now their lives were more Americanized and they would act as normal white citizens would. This was also called assimilation, which was trying to make natives act as white citizens. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged settlement out west. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of land by living on it for 5 years, improving it, and then paying a fee of $30 at the end of the period of 5 years. This was very favorable for people who could not afford to buy land. Over 500,000 Americans took on the opportunity, though some of the land was not always in the best locations. Sometimes the land was of bad quality and had inconsistent rain and weather patterns. Also, high cost of supplies and fluctuating crop prices also was a challenge to many of the people that moved out west. In addition to the challenges, many railroad companies would make up fake names in order to acquire new land for their companies. Furthermore, there was the late 19th century farm crisis. There are many problems for farmers like falling prices, unfair railroads, business practices, high cost of machinery, and tight money supply, and most importantly, high tariffs. One thing that came from the farm crisis was the Granger movement. It was organized social and educational activities for farmers. One of their wants was government regulation and ownership of business. This would make their business more profitable and more organized. Next is the populist movement. The Granger movement and the farmer alliances led to the third-party populists. Many of their wants and demands consisted of these: government ownership of railroads, free and unlimited coinage of silver at a 16-to-1 ratio, graduated income tax, which means rich people pay more taxes, direct elections of senators, and they wanted to use the initiative and the referendums. The populists, despite their oddities, had their successes. In the 1892 election, the populists won several congressional seats. They also polled more than 1 million votes for the presidential candidate, Weaver. The presidential election of 1896. The Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, was known as the Dark Horse. He was a very great orator and gave a famous speech of the Cross of Gold at the convention. He favored the free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16-to-1 ratio to help the less wealthy. He also wanted to lower tariffs for the poor. The Republican candidate of the presidential election of 1896 was William McKinley. Republicans favored high protected tariffs for the wealthy. During his campaign, he used front porch speeches for his campaign to make it seem like he was more for the people by giving the speeches on his front porch. The results. McKinley wins 271 of the electoral votes in populous New England and in the upper Mississippi Valley. Bryan wins 176 electoral votes in the debt-burdened South and the Mississippi West. This election told the death of the Gilded Age political party system. For many years after the 1896 election, Republicans predominated and citizens showed a declining interest in joining political parties and voting.